Hello and welcome to another episode of my Datsun 280z project car build. I'm Dave, this is Grates Performance Engineering, and in today's episode I'm doing a deeper dive into Fusion 360 and the design of my 3D printed gauge cluster. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments, and liking the video, it really helps. Let's get into it. To come up with the shape for the lens hood, I've done a couple different sketches here. So this first sketch here is kind of the cross-sectional area that's going to get revolved around the gauge. And then we're going to have kind of a W-shaped cutout, like you can kind of see here, is kind of like a W, right? So that's going to be the second cut that we're going to have to make. So this first one here is going to dictate how tall the gauge is going to be, and then how much spacing between the inside of it is going to have compared to the outside of the bezel here. We're going to have to figure this out as well. So by measuring the OD of the gauge, that gives us a little bit of spacing here that we've created. I think it's a couple mil. And then if we revolve it, we get this first feature here, right? And then the second sketch that we came up with is this kind of W shape. I didn't do anything like really crazy with this. I just kind of played around with different splines to figure out, you know, what kind of looked right based on the actual lens hood that I've got here. And then with those two things combined, we were able to go ahead and come up with this profile here. This is really nice. I like this a lot. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna do some more dimensioning to this first. So we're gonna add a lot more depth to this because we're gonna have to actually make the pod. Right now this is just floating in space, right? So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna add some more depth here. We've just added some depth there. We're gonna add a little bit more because we know that this is gonna have to pass through the laser cut aluminum that's going to be the main frame for it, right? So we want to make sure that the hood protrudes past where that material is, so we need to add at least that much thickness to this piece to be able to do that, right? So we know that the frame is going to have to get bolted to the pod in some way. So we've added a couple bolt holes at this point, and we also we added 3 bolt holes. And then this area is a negative here because we're going to actually have 3 bolts for the other gauge as well. So we still haven't, on the backside here, this area is really tight. So the next thing that we have to do is make sure that we've got enough clearance for getting hand in there to be able to actually tighten the rings that are going to be on each of the backsides of the gauges, right? So by doing a couple eyeball measurements there, we can go ahead and delete some of this inner ring here to give us a lot more clearance to be able to get a tool or get our hands in there to install or remove the trim rings on the back side of each of the gauges. So I've gone ahead and I moved the second gauge over. There was definitely a lot of room to work with here. And then I just kind of copied the features here because the hood is going to be exactly the same. The gauge has the same measurement. So we just brought all those features over. And what we're having to come up with now is kind of this puzzle on the back side of it, because we want to make sure that each of the gauges are robustly mounted into the frame the best that we can get it. So I split this up to be 3 bolts for this gauge and then 3 bolts for this gauge, but then you have 1 bolt pattern which will be visible, and it's going to be symmetrical through the gauges. I think it's going to look really nice. And then this seam here is going to get hidden by the aluminum frame that's going to be going in between it. So that the area between these 2 main gauges look a little bit kind of funny. So I saw this as an opportunity to add a check engine light to the cluster. I wanted to do this anyway, but this seemed like a good opportunity to do that. So I added the quick sketch here, just basically some quick dimensions based on the bulkhead LED that I'm going to be using, and then adding some fillets and things like that. We were able to come up with this, which basically my thought is the aluminum frame is going to have a smaller hole, and the LED is actually going to be bolted only to the aluminum frame, and then this is just basically a pass-through. So we're going to have to add some kind of channel for the wiring to be able to run through, but we can work on that on the back side when we get to that point. By extruding a projection of this shape here, we can start on the back half of the gauges. So remember, we're going to be 3D printing a front and a back half for each of the different gauge pods. So just by starting, I'm just going to extrude that, and then that gives us that same profile, but we have to neck it back down because remember, there's going to be a frame that's going to be running on this surface, a metal frame, and I'm going to be running one on the back side as well. So we have to have kind of from this extrusion here, another cylinder that's going to come up here. And then this is going to be kind of what the grating is going to set on, the bolts for that and stuff. We'll add some fillets here to round this over, and then that will kind of clean that up. But this way, the diameter of this and the diameter of this are the same, and then we can pass metal frames through the front and then pass the metal frame over the rear when we go to actually assemble everything together, and we can laser cut the pieces to be identical, which will save us a little bit of money, and I think it'll look really nice. I've made this in a couple stages. I started with a construction plane, and that plane was this surface here, which was a distance from the center line of the two different halves where they meet, distance up to here, which is just shy of the rim here. And then I actually took a little bit more off because we want to have, you see that difference there if I go back and forth from there to there? That's going to be the thickness of the laser cut piece of metal that we're going to be adding as well, because we want to recess that in. We don't want it to like be proud of that. We want it to sink in and fit really nicely. One of the cool things about this is since we're getting rid of the whole dashboard of the car, this is definitely going to be visible from all sides from the outside of the car. This is going to be mounted directly to the roll cage, and it's definitely going to be visible. So like this whole backside here, we can do some really cool things to make it really unique and draw people in. So I'm thinking I want to do this grating here. This is kind of the pattern. It's the same pattern that was on the headlights that I used. The backside that had a fan, there was this little metal plate that had this kind of round pattern to it, and I really liked it. So I think we're going to carry this through each of the gauges, and I'm thinking maybe we do something special with the center one, like maybe like a Z logo or something. But we'll get there when we get there. But this is looking really promising. I'm really happy about this. I went ahead and duplicated all those features, and we can start to see what the back of this thing's going to look like. I'm digging it. I think it's going to be really cool. The gauges came with this rotary dial which controls the brightness of the actual gauges, and I thought it would be cool to add it to the actual assembly. I didn't know if I could originally. I didn't know where it would fit and look right, but I think on the side here it could actually be kind of cool. So this sketch here is a little bit complicated, but let me kind of walk you through it. So this slotted feature here that I've got highlighted, this is going to get extruded through the assembly so that this whole piece can basically come in and out of the plastic, right? So it's going to split both of the halves of the bodies of the 3D print, and it's going to go straight through the plastic. Then this outer shell here, this is going to be the actual metal piece that's going to be going on top. And then the holes, basically this is to add clearance for any kind of washers. I'm going to be using those heat set nuts again on this. So the different circles are going to be basically those different distances that I have to be mindful of to make sure that I've got enough thickness of material for those heat set nuts to be able to have enough room and things like that. So by taking this sketch, I was able to come up with this. Which I think looks really cool on the side here. So this section here with these 3 gauges, I can't actually print that in one piece. So I'm splitting this up into 3 different pieces. So there's going to be the right gauge, the left gauge, and then I'm going to combine the center gauge and then this keyboard here. So this is going to be printed into one piece as well. And then each of these are going to have a front half and a back half. The next thing I went ahead and modeled are the lens hoods for the 3 gauges up top. The effect isn't nearly as dramatic here because I wanted these gauges to be really, really small compared to the big ones. But you still get some of that 3-dimensionality, and we still get a lot of that shape, that contour that really matches really well. I think it does a nice job of not being quite as big, but then still having that same effect there. The one thing that I did keep in mind here was the thickness here at the top. This area here, this is exactly the width of 2 lines of my 3D printer. So one thing that you think about is the nozzle size of your 3D printer, right? And for something like this, I know I want it to be really delicate, really fine. So I made that the exact diameter of two widths of 2 passes of the nozzle, basically to make that as simple as possible to get printed, so there's not any weird like aberrations or effects on that surface. I'm hoping that it's going to help it out to print as cleanly as possible. When you start incorporating laser cutting, it's very easy for a design to just be like really flat and kind of boring. And so adding as much depth as you can with different layers and different dimensionalities will make it a lot more interesting. So I originally was going to have this mounted up top here, but I think I'm going to actually drop this down. So I dropped it down to this level because remember, all of these parts here, these are actually separate bodies between the top and the bottom here. And they're going to be printed up and then printed down when we go to print it. So if we know that that's where the main seam is, we can take advantage of that with this keyboard. And then let's pick it up just a little bit more here. So now when we look at it from the side here and zoom in, this distance here, this is going to be the thickness that is going to get mounted, that the keyboard itself is going to get mounted to. So next thing I started on was the front half of this center gauge plus can keyboard mount. I've got a couple holes here for the studs. I've got a couple holes, or one hole for the wiring, and then another hole so that you'll actually be able to get the trim ring around it. This is just kind of the start here. So it's gotta go forward, obviously, and then we have to add the bezel because we want this to be recessed in here. So if we move it forward here, I extruded this out to be able to do that. And then I also added access in the back side here so that you can get your fingers in there to tighten and loosen the trim ring. So most of this was drawn just tracing the bodies of the gauges that we've already gone ahead and designed. But then I kind of took a couple different approaches for a couple different areas. So underneath this gauge cluster, the dash bar is just going to be a horizontal bar that runs across, and we need to be able to attach this cluster to the roll cage. It's going to be bolted directly to it. So I've added these features on the bottom here, these little winglets, and this is going to let a piece of 3/4 inch round tubing with a couple plates on either side basically be standoffs off the roll cage. It took quite a lot of time actually coming up with this kind of shape here. I did a lot of attempts where I started to get into it and I didn't really like how it was looking, so I would just start over. And this is a shape that I'm really happy with. It fits really tight to the back of the body. I think it's gonna look really natural because you're probably gonna be able to see this from outside of the car. So I wanted to make sure that it looked really nice. And then I did add on the front here this little piece here to help some of that tunneling. I think I'm gonna add a little bit more of a feature here so it's not just flat. What am I doing? Let's rotate that. I did add this little bridge here on both the front and the back of the gauge to give a little bit more area to be able to pass wiring through if needed. But we're still kind of having this pinch point here, which is gonna get really tight. But I wanna add just a little bit more here. And then I went ahead and I added the back gauges as well here, or the back halves of each of the 3D prints. So this is going to be the back half, and then this will be the front half for these little gauges as well. I'm doing the same thing that I did for the big gauges as well. It's the same process entirely, where I just took the perimeter and just extruded it out as a separate part. So we're trying to make as many of these profiles the same as we can, just to keep it pretty simple here. One thing we talked about was being able to bolt this half of the print to this half of the print by using those studs in the can keyboard. I don't think that's going to be possible. I spent a lot of time, now that I have an idea of what's the biggest size that I can make this window here, of trying to get a tool in there, and it's not going to be being able to get a nut on there is just not going to be possible. It's going to be a huge pain in the neck. So I think what I'm going to do is, I've got a couple options here. I could either add a bolted feature on the outside of the shell here. I can't really do anything internal, because that perimeter around the keyboard is so narrow that there's no way to like build it into the wall that's already there. So I would have to have a protrusion and have it stick out, but I don't really want it to do that. I kind of am thinking that I'm gonna take a little bit of a risk and not run any connection between this side of the shell and this side of the shell for this gauge, and try to count on the prints being a glass on glass surface. You know, it should be flat, hopefully, and then kind of count on the rest of the assembly here to actually be what keeps that clamped together. So with the between the two different frames, being able to have enough squeeze to hold that together. I don't know. That might be asking a little bit too much of it. We might wind up with a little bit of an air gap on the bottom here, which would mean we're going to have to do it over. But I don't really like the idea. It looks so clean the way that it is right now. I don't really want to add more things that bump out and then add more to the back of it, especially since all that's going to be visible. I really like the idea of it being totally clean and totally smooth. So we'll see what happens, but we won't know that until we actually go to put it together. So it's going to be a risk. I went ahead and I added the cylinders for the backside of the triple gauges here. So these are 3 different prints, right? So, well, I guess this is one print, and then you've got this one and this one. And so now it's got the same features to match the big gauge, and then we've added the bolt holes here to add the grating as well. This area gets pretty tight though. You can see the gauges there. There's not a ton of extra room there, and I need to make sure that there's enough room to be able to actually put that heat nut in. And then you don't want it so close to the plastic that when you go to set it in, you don't want it so close to this wall that when you go to insert it, that you get so much heat in it that you end up deforming this as well. So I kind of stuck them in a little bit so that they're not directly against the wall. You want to give it a little bit of breathing room, I think, because you don't want to end up melting the wall after you spent all this time printing everything. Would kind of suck. So next we're gonna go ahead, I'm gonna do the same design here, but I think I want to mix it up. I think I want to do this design for this gauge, and then the center one, we'll do something a little different. This looks really cool. I'm super pumped. So I've got all the grading in now. What I wound up doing is I modeled this basically the same way. I proportioned the grates a little bit differently than it was on the big gauges, obviously. But then I had enough room to work with to add the Z logo into the center gauge. I think that'll be super cool because you're definitely going to see that from outside of the car. And I think that that's just awesome. Like, it's unmistakable as it is to me already. It's the same profile as the factory dash, and it's so historic for all the different generations of the car. This is really cool. Looking at this now, I'm really proud of this, guys. This is cool. So I've been going through the assembly and adding all the features to let the wiring pass through everything. Obviously, everything needs to be able to get connected to everything, or else nothing's gonna work, right? So to be able to do that, I started with the main gauge here. So the tach and the speedometer here have these big openings at the very bottom. So all the wiring for everything's going to be able to pass through those. I think that maybe the brightness knob wires, and then the wiring for this gauge. I have a multi-gauge for the speedo. It has like the built-in fuel level and turn signals and high beams and stuff. So I think all of that wiring alone is going to run through this one, and then everything for the CAN keyboard and these 3 gauges and this whole section is going to run through this one, just to kind of split it up a little bit. Then I've added this. So this was for the check engine light up top in the middle. We needed a pass through for this. This was another one where that LED is hardwired, so you need to be able to either pass the wiring through with the connector, or you have to like de-pin it if you go to disconnect it. So by adding this little tunnel here, you could actually slide the wires themselves through it, and you should be okay, no matter what connector's on the end, because it's going to connect to like a big bulk connector, right? And there's no way it's going to pass through that area. So that should cover that. This area then, so this is the pass through that we're talking about being really tight. Most of the wires, or all of the wires for the CAN keyboard and these 3 gauges are going to have to pass through this area here. And then I added this tunnel here from the CAN keyboard if we need any extra space there. And then this for each of the individual gauges going up here. Should be plenty of room. I measured the size of the wiring, and through here should be totally fine. It's this one here that things get a little bit tight. I think that's everything for modeling. I think we're ready to put in an order with Send Cut Send and get to 3D printing and see what we've got. I guess we'll be learning a lot about what's gonna work and what's not gonna work, but man, I'm stoked. This is awesome. I love the way it looks. It was such a challenge for me. This is definitely the craziest thing I've had to design in a long time, and I love it. It looks so freaking cool. I am stoked. But yeah, I'm gonna put an order in. We're gonna start 3D printing, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.